8 lives stolen in a single night, a city shaken to its core, and a gunman who claimed his violence was an act of faith. This is not just a story of murder. It is a haunting collision of religion, obsession, and tragedy you cannot look away from. On the evening of March 16, 2021, the city of Atlanta carried on with its usual rhythm. Traffic pulsed through the highways, businesses prepared to close for the night, and countless families wound down after another ordinary Tuesday. Yet beneath that ordinary calm, a storm was building in the mind of one young man whose choices would soon fracture the lives of many. Robert Aaron Long, just 21 years old, drove the familiar roads of Cherokee County with a new weapon tucked beside him, a 9mm handgun he had legally purchased earlier that very day. He had convinced himself that the weight of his personal demons could only be relieved through violence, and by night's end, his conviction would leave 8 people dead, 1 more severely wounded, and an entire nation shaken. Long was not the archetype of a hardened criminal. By all outward appearances, he was the quiet son of a religious household. He had grown up in Woodstock, Georgia, raised in a conservative evangelical environment, where church attendance was mandatory and rigid morality guided daily life. His peers later recalled him as awkward, deeply withdrawn, and carrying a kind of tension that rarely eased even in casual conversation. Those who knew him well spoke of the intensity of his faith, how he quoted scripture and spoke about sin with a seriousness that often felt suffocating. But alongside that devotion ran something darker, a consuming obsession with sexual temptation and a tormenting guilt over his inability to control it. From an early age, Long internalized the message that sexuality outside of marriage was not just wrong, but a grievous sin. As he grew older, his struggles with pornography and sexual impulses collided head-on with the doctrine he had been taught to live by. His guilt evolved into self-loathing, and his visits to massage parlors offering sexual services only intensified that spiral. He began to see those establishments not simply as businesses, but as traps that reinforced his weakness, luring him toward what he considered spiritual corruption. By March 2021, those conflicted thoughts had hardened into a singular obsession, to rid himself of temptation by erasing the places he blamed for it. The first destination on Long's path was Young's Asian Massage, located in Ackworth, about 30 miles north of downtown Atlanta. Inside the modest building, life unfolded in ordinary ways. The spa's owner, Xiaojia Emily Tan, a 49-year-old immigrant from China, tended to her work with her usual quiet determination. She had built the business through years of sacrifice, becoming a trusted figure in her community. On this evening, she was joined by her employee, 44-year-old Dao Yufeng, who had only recently started working there. Both women were focused on their duties, unaware that danger was already approaching. Also inside was Delana Ashley Yon, a 33-year-old mother of 2. She had chosen the spa as a place to unwind, sharing the moment with her husband in what was meant to be a couple's massage. For her, the evening was intended to be an escape, a rare chance to focus on herself and her new marriage. In another room, 54-year-old Paul Andre Michaels, an Army veteran turned repairman, was at work. Known for his humor and easygoing nature, Michaels was helping with equipment installation that night, far removed from any notion of violence. Just outside the spa, 30-year-old Elcias Hernandez Ortiz waited in the parking lot. He was a hard-working father, speaking on the phone with his wife while arranging errands. None of them had any warning of the man about to walk through the door. At around 5 p.m., Long stepped inside, the gun heavy in his grip, his mind sharpened into a chilling focus. He later admitted that he did not see human beings in front of him, only what he described as temptation embodied, obstacles in the path of his salvation. Shots rang out in quick succession, echoing off the spa's small rooms. Panic spread instantly. By the time the gunfire stopped, 4 people lay dead. Emily Tan, who had given so much of her life to her business, was gone. Dao Yufeng, still new to her role at the spa, was killed before her life in America had truly taken root. Delana Yon's visit for relaxation ended in tragedy. Her husband left to survive the horror of watching her fall. Paul Michaels, the veteran with years of service behind him, also lost his life. Outside, Hernandez Ortiz collapsed after being struck by a bullet, his body bleeding but still clinging to life. He would later endure multiple surgeries, his recovery marked by permanent injuries. But that night, survival itself was uncertain. For the families who would soon receive phone calls, the world shifted in an instant. For Long, the mission was only half complete. After the first killings, he climbed back into his car and began driving toward Atlanta. His thoughts were not of remorse but of continuation. He had already crossed the threshold of violence, and his obsession told him the job was unfinished. The weight of his upbringing pressed on him, merging with years of distorted belief that he could cleanse himself through destruction. While police and emergency responders rushed to the first crime scene, Long's vehicle sped down the interstate, a moving extension of his torment. In the neighborhoods of northeast Atlanta, two other businesses stood only a short distance apart: Gold Spa and Aromatherapy Spa. To the casual passerby, they were ordinary establishments tucked between other small businesses, part of the urban fabric. To Long, they represented the same cycle of temptation he had convinced himself he must end. The drive into the city stretched on, headlights cutting through dusk as he planned his next steps. By the time he reached the heart of Atlanta, news of the Cherokee County shootings had already begun to circulate. Yet the city had no idea that another wave of violence was minutes away. The story of what happened inside those spas would soon compound the tragedy already unfolding. Women who had left their homelands in search of opportunity, who had built quiet lives serving customers and supporting families, suddenly found themselves in the path of a man carrying not only a gun but also years of twisted beliefs. The evening of March 16th was only beginning to reveal its full horror, and Atlanta was about to become the focal point of grief and outrage across the world. The clock inched toward evening as police scrambled with fragmented information, dispatch radios filling with urgent updates. For the employees and clients inside Gold Spa and Aromatherapy Spa, there was no warning, no chance to prepare. In the span of minutes, Long would leave behind more victims, deepening a tragedy that was no longer a single act of violence but a coordinated massacre. As his car pulled into the city, the weight of history bore down on what was about to happen next. As Robert Aaron Long steered his car into northeast Atlanta, the sun dipped lower, shadows lengthening across the city streets. The neon signs of small businesses flickered to life, and traffic buzzed steadily along Piedmont Road. It was a part of town where daily routines blurred together. Shops closing, workers finishing their shifts, restaurants preparing for dinner crowds. In that ordinariness lay a fragile peace, one that Long was about to shatter in an eruption of violence that would ripple far beyond Atlanta's borders. Gold Spa stood just off the main stretch, its modest exterior belying the lives within. Inside, 3 women carried out their usual tasks, tending to clients, organizing supplies, and speaking softly in their native tongues between appointments. 74-year-old Soon Chung Park, the eldest among them, had spent decades of her life working diligently, providing for her loved ones and holding on to the routines that had carried her from South Korea to America. Beside her was 69-year-old Sun Cha Kim, another immigrant whose devotion to family was the cornerstone of her days. Then there was 51-year-old Hyun Young Grant, a single mother of 2 teenage sons. Her children described her as playful, loving, and strong. Someone who balanced the heaviness of work with bursts of joy at home, often dancing with her boys to the music they loved. For her, the spa was a place of work, a means of survival, and a sacrifice she carried so her sons could have a future. As Long approached the building, his mind sharpened into a grim resolve. He had already crossed the line from thought to action, and in his distorted vision, the women inside represented the same temptation he wanted to erase. He entered the spa with the same weapon he had carried in Cherokee County, and within moments, the stillness of the rooms was pierced by the sound of gunfire. The women had no time to comprehend, no chance to plead or escape. In seconds, 3 lives were extinguished. Soon Chung Park, who had reached an age where most should have been surrounded by the comfort of family and rest, fell to the violence of a man decades her junior. Sun Cha Kim, who had built her life on care and sacrifice, lost everything in an instant. Hyun Young Grant, whose two sons would later cry out in anguish on television, was taken from them without warning, leaving behind children who would never again hear her laughter or feel her embrace. Long's actions in Gold Spa were deliberate, swift, and devastating. But he was not finished. Only steps away across the street stood Aromatherapy Spa, another business woven into the same community fabric. Inside, 63-year-old Young Ae carried out her duties with the steadiness that had defined her life since immigrating from South Korea. Known for her warmth and generosity, she had built a reputation among friends and family as someone dependable, someone who extended kindness wherever she went. That evening, she was unaware that her final hours had already arrived. Long crossed the road, entered the second spa, and once again raised his weapon. The burst of violence that followed left Young Ae dead. In the space of less than an hour, Long had taken the lives of 8 people across 2 counties, leaving behind scenes of devastation and horror. The sound of police sirens would arrive too late for those inside, but for the families of the victims, the silence that followed the shots would echo forever. The Atlanta police, already alerted to the earlier shooting in Cherokee County, quickly connected the unfolding events. Calls flooded into dispatch centers, and officers rushed toward the spas. Outside Gold Spa, the flashing lights of patrol cars illuminated the night, drawing the attention of stunned bystanders who whispered in disbelief at the unfolding tragedy. Within minutes, the scale of the massacre became clear. 8 lives lost, 1 man severely injured, and a city plunged into chaos. News crews scrambled to the scenes, cameras capturing the heavy presence of law enforcement and the sorrow etched on the faces of onlookers. The images would soon be broadcast across the country and the world, sparking outrage, grief, and urgent questions. Was this a hate crime? Was it misogyny? Was it a twisted blend of religious zeal and personal torment? The answers were not immediate, but the shock was. The fact that 6 of the 8 victims were Asian women ignited fear and anger within the Asian American community, which had already been reeling from a surge in violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. To many, the shootings were not isolated, but part of a wider pattern of racialized violence, misogyny, and scapegoating. As investigators pieced together the timeline, the manhunt for Long intensified. Police tracked his vehicle as it fled south, information relayed from county to county. Highway patrol officers finally spotted his car on Interstate 75, and a chase ensued. For a tense stretch of road, lights flashed behind him, sirens wailed, and the endgame drew closer. Long eventually pulled over, surrendering without resistance. Inside his vehicle, officers found the weapon that had already claimed 8 lives. In custody, Long spoke with investigators, offering a rationale that stunned the public with its cold detachment. He claimed the spas represented temptations to him, places that fed his so-called sex addiction. He framed his massacre not as an act of hatred against a race, but as a personal mission to cleanse himself of sin by eliminating what he believed lured him. His explanation revealed a fractured psyche molded by strict religious teachings and twisted by obsession. But to the families grieving their loved ones, his words were an insult, a justification that failed to acknowledge the humanity of those he had gunned down. As news of his arrest spread, vigils began to form. Communities across Atlanta and beyond gathered to mourn, candles glowing against the dark sky. Family members stepped forward to share stories of the victims, painting portraits far richer than the labels of spa workers or immigrants. They were mothers, fathers, daughters, sisters, veterans, small business owners, friends. Each carried histories and hopes that were brutally cut short. For the sons of Hyun Young Grant, the grief was raw and public. They described the sudden void left in their lives, the disbelief that their mother, who had always been their anchor, was gone. For Delana Yeon's family, the pain was equally sharp. Her husband, who had survived the shooting by mere chance, faced a life forever altered, raising children without the woman who had shared their dreams. The Michaels family mourned a man remembered for his humor and service, while friends of Emily Tan and Dao Yu Feng grappled with the cruel theft of women whose stories as immigrants spoke to resilience and sacrifice. The magnitude of the tragedy reached beyond personal grief. The shooting sparked political debates about the rise of violence against Asian Americans, about the intersection of race and gender in crimes of this nature, and about the broader social consequences of religious extremism intertwined with repression. Yet amid the debates, the immediate reality remained. 8 people were dead, and their families left to carry wounds that would never truly heal. That night, Atlanta was a city heavy with grief. The glow of candles and vigils across neighborhoods marked not just the loss of lives but the urgency of questions about how and why this had happened. Police tapes still surrounded the spas. Crime scene investigators moved silently with their equipment, and the hum of media coverage grew louder by the hour. But for those directly touched by the violence, the night was not about politics or headlines. It was about faces, voices, and memories stolen forever. Long sat in custody, calm in demeanor but cold in his reasoning. The weight of his actions had yet to collide with the full force of justice. Outside the jail, anger and sorrow mounted. Across the nation, the names of the victims began to circulate, each story shining light on the ordinary lives destroyed by extraordinary cruelty. In that moment, Atlanta stood at the center of a storm of mourning, protest, and reckoning, as the reality of what had happened on March 16th unfolded in all its devastating clarity. In the days that followed March 16, 2021, Atlanta became a city cloaked in grief, while the rest of the country turned its eyes toward Georgia. Outside the spas where the shootings took place, makeshift memorials began to grow. Flowers, candles, handwritten notes, and photographs of the victims lined the sidewalks, each item a testament to lives stolen too soon. Strangers who had never met the women and men who died came forward to stand vigil, their faces lit by candlelight, united by a shared sense of loss and outrage. For families left behind, the shock was overwhelming. Their lives upended in a single night. The mothers, fathers, siblings, and children of the victims struggled to comprehend that the ordinary routines of work and family had ended in sudden, violent tragedy. The story quickly spread across the nation and the world, amplified by a larger backdrop of fear and anger. For months, Asian American communities had been speaking out about a surge in harassment and violence tied to the pandemic, and now this massacre seemed to embody those fears in the starkest way possible. The fact that 6 of the 8 victims were Asian women fueled a painful conversation about racism, misogyny, and the intersections of both. Activists and community leaders pointed to the long history of sexualized stereotypes about Asian women, arguing that even if Robert Aaron long denied racial motivations, his choice of targets spoke volumes. The attacks became a rallying cry, with marches and vigils across major cities demanding justice, accountability, and protection for vulnerable communities. Meanwhile, investigators and prosecutors began their meticulous work. Long's arrest had brought him into the spotlight, and the public wanted answers. His statements to police framed his actions as a way of eliminating temptation, rooted in what he called a sex addiction. He described the spas as sources of sin, places that threatened his resolve to live righteously according to his evangelical upbringing. But to many observers, his explanation rang hollow, a way to sidestep the deeper implications of his crime. Law enforcement initially sparked controversy when a spokesperson described Long as having a bad day, a comment widely criticized as insensitive and dismissive of the victims. The backlash was swift, forcing officials to clarify their stance and reaffirm that the seriousness of the crime was never in question. For the victims' families, the legal proceedings became a grueling process of reliving the trauma in courtrooms and hearings. In Cherokee County, where the first 4 murders had occurred, prosecutors moved quickly. Long eventually pled guilty to those charges, accepting responsibility for the deaths of Delana Ashley Yon, Paul Andre Michaels, Xiao Jiatan, and Dao Yu Feng. The plea deal spared him the death penalty but condemned him to life in prison without parole. For some families, the certainty of his life behind bars brought a measure of relief. For others, no sentence could ever feel equal to the pain of their loss. In Fulton County, where the other 4 victims were killed, prosecutors took a different path. District Attorney Fonnie Willis announced she would seek the death penalty, framing the killings as crimes motivated by bias against race and gender. Her decision underscored the gravity of the attack and the desire to recognize its broader social impact. Yet even as the legal machinery turned, the debate over Long's true motive raged on. Was he a man driven by religious extremism and self-loathing over his desires? Was he fueled by racialized misogyny, consciously or unconsciously targeting Asian women because of the stereotypes he held? Or was it, as some argued, a toxic fusion of both personal guilt intertwined with cultural prejudice? Outside the courtrooms, families tried to pick up the pieces of lives that could never be whole again. The sons of Hyun Young Grant, left without their mother, spoke publicly about the void in their lives. Their grief struck a chord with audiences nationwide, and a fundraiser created to support them exceeded expectations, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was a gesture of solidarity from strangers. Yet the reality remained that no amount of money could replace the woman who had been their anchor. For the family of Delana Yon, the sudden absence of a mother and wife meant daily struggles with the routines of childcare and survival, while also grappling with the lasting trauma of the husband who had been present during her final moments. Each family carried its own version of the nightmare, private and unending. The broader community also felt the weight of the shootings. For Asian Americans across the country, the massacre intensified a collective sense of vulnerability. Town halls, community meetings, and vigils became spaces not only of mourning but of testimony, where individuals recounted their own experiences of racism and fear. Politicians, including President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, traveled to Atlanta to meet with community leaders and families of the victims, acknowledging both the immediate pain and the larger context of racial violence in America. The message was clear. This was not just an isolated crime but a tragedy intertwined with systemic issues that demanded national attention. Religious communities, too, found themselves confronting difficult questions. Long's background in evangelical Christianity highlighted the potential dangers of rigid teachings around sexuality and sin, especially when combined with isolation and mental instability. Pastors and congregations across the country engaged in discussions about how messages of morality are delivered, how shame can fester into destructive behavior, and how faith communities can either help or harm those struggling with guilt. While many distanced themselves from Long's actions, seeing them as a distortion of faith, others reflected uneasily on the culture that had shaped him. As the months passed, the spas where the shootings took place became symbols of resilience as well as loss. Memorials continued to grow, and anniversaries of the attack were marked with ceremonies honoring the victims. Names like Soon Chung Park, Sun Cha Kim, Hyun Young Grant, and Yong Ae were spoken aloud not as statistics but as lives to be remembered. In classrooms, town halls, and media reports, their stories became part of a broader narrative about race, gender, and violence in America. For the survivors, healing was uneven. Elshas Hernandez-Ortiz, the man shot in the parking lot of Young's Asian Massage, faced a long road of medical treatment and recovery. His body bore the scars of the attack, while his family bore the emotional scars of almost losing him. His survival was a reminder of both the brutality of the crime and the resilience required to move forward. Robert Aaron Long, meanwhile, spent his days behind bars, his name forever linked with one of the most notorious crimes of the decade. In the public imagination, he became a figure representing the convergence of personal torment, religious repression, and social prejudice. Yet for those who lost loved ones, he was less a symbol than the man who had taken irreplaceable people from their lives. His motives, however analyzed and debated, would never bring back the dead. As the final chapter of the case moved through the courts, one truth remained steady. The Atlanta spa shootings were not only about one man's choices, but about the countless lives those choices affected. The tragedy left scars on families, communities, and the nation's conscience. It forced America to look again at the dangers of racialized violence, the consequences of toxic shame, and the fragile line between personal belief and destructive action. On anniversaries of the attack, the names of the victims are spoken once more. Families gather, candles are lit, and tears are shed. They are remembered not just as victims of a crime, but as people whose lives mattered, mothers who loved their children, workers who sacrificed for their families, elders who deserved peace, friends who left behind laughter and kindness. Against the darkness of March 16, 2021, Their memory continues to burn as a light, reminding the world of what was lost and why it must never be forgotten. On a warm summer night in Charleston, a historic church opened its doors to worshipers, and unknowingly to a killer driven by hate. What followed shocked the nation, exposing the dark reality of racism and the unshakable power of faith. This is the story you cannot look away from. On the evening of June 17, 2015, Charleston carried the stillness of a warm summer night. The streets of the historic South Carolina city, lined with oak trees and flickering street lamps, seemed ordinary to passers-by. But inside one of the nation's oldest black churches, a quiet gathering was about to be transformed into tragedy. Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, affectionately known as Mother Emanuel, had stood as a beacon of faith and resilience for nearly 2 centuries. Built upon a foundation of endurance during slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and the Civil Rights Movement, the church represented not just a house of worship, but a sanctuary where the black community had gathered for generations to seek comfort, strength, and unity. That night, the sanctuary welcomed both familiar faces and one stranger, unaware that the stranger's intentions carried the weight of violence and hatred. The Bible study was a weekly ritual. A small group of parishioners came together in the fellowship hall, sharing scripture, prayers, and community. There was no sense of suspicion, no hesitation to open the doors to someone new. Hospitality was a principle deeply rooted in the church's legacy. And so when a young white man entered and asked to join, he was welcomed without question. He was quiet, withdrawn, and appeared to be little more than a curious visitor, perhaps searching for guidance. He introduced himself simply, then sat among the faithful as they opened their Bibles. For nearly an hour, he blended into the rhythm of their devotion, listening as voices filled the room with warmth and prayer. To the worshipers, he was just another soul seeking God's word. But inside him, a storm of hatred brewed. That young man was Dylan Storm Roof, a 21-year-old whose life had spiraled into isolation, resentment, and extremist ideology. Roof had grown up in South Carolina, his childhood marked not by remarkable trauma, but by an increasing sense of alienation. Friends and acquaintances would later describe him as odd, withdrawn, and deeply introverted. He drifted away from school and any sense of community, immersing himself instead in the digital world. Online, he discovered racist forums, white nationalist propaganda, and conspiracy theories that convinced him black people were enemies of his imagined future. Photographs later recovered from his social media accounts would reveal him posing with Confederate flags, holding guns, and wearing patches tied to apartheid-era South Africa and Rhodesia, symbols of racist regimes. Roof believed he had a mission: to spark a race war that would tear America apart and, in his mind, restore white dominance. Choosing Emmanuel AME was not an accident. The church had been a spiritual cornerstone for African Americans since the early 1800s, surviving persecution, arson, and decades of racial hostility. It was the Church of Denmark Vesey, a free black man who had planned a major slave rebellion in 1822 before being executed. Vesey's legacy lived within Mother Emanuel, making the church a potent symbol of resistance against racial oppression. To Roof, targeting such a historic and sacred place was not only about killing individuals, it was about striking at the very heart of black identity and faith in America. Inside the fellowship hall that night, among those gathered was Reverend Clementa Pinckney, the church's senior pastor. At just 41 years old, Pinckney carried himself with a calm authority and a sense of purpose that extended beyond his congregation. He was not only a minister but also a South Carolina state senator, deeply respected for his leadership, his voice in the fight for civil rights, and his efforts to bring communities together. For the parishioners, his presence was a source of reassurance. At his side were pillars of the community, each one a thread in the fabric of Charleston's black heritage. Sharonda Coleman Singleton, 45, was there as both assistant pastor and a devoted member of her community. Known as a passionate speech therapist and coach, she was a woman who balanced faith with mentorship, shaping young lives both in church and in school. Alongside her was Tawanza Sanders, just 26, full of ambition and energy. A recent college graduate, Tawanza dreamed of building businesses and inspiring others. That evening, he had come to Bible study with his aunt, Susie Jackson, the 87-year-old matriarch of the group, beloved for her gentle spirit and dedication to the church choir. There was also Ethel Lance, 70, who had cared for Emmanuel AME for decades as its sexton, tending to the building with love and pride. Daniel Simmons Sr., a 74-year-old retired pastor and veteran, carried the wisdom of both faith and service to his country. Myra Thompson, 59, was leading the study that night, guiding the group through Scripture with her calm and spiritual presence. DePayne Middleton Doctor, 49, whose singing voice had long uplifted the congregation, sat with quiet devotion, while Cynthia Hurd, 54, a lifelong librarian, brought with her a passion for education and service that had touched countless lives. Together, they represented not just a congregation, but the heartbeat of their community. Mentors, leaders, family members, and friends bound by faith. They had come that evening to reflect, to share, and to find peace in Scripture. Ruth sat silently among them. The contrast between the love in that room and the darkness in his mind could not have been greater. He listened as prayers were spoken, as Bible verses were shared, as faith carried voices into the stillness of night. He appeared engaged, flipping through the pages of Scripture, but his thoughts were fixed on the gun he carried concealed in his bag. For him, every passing moment was a countdown. When the prayer circle bowed their heads, Ruth rose. He drew his weapon and began firing. The room erupted into chaos, screams piercing through the stillness. Bullets tore through bodies, silencing voices that had moments before been lifted in worship. Tawanza Sanders leapt forward, pleading with Ruth to stop, showing bravery beyond his years. Ruth ignored him and continued his slaughter, determined to carry out his twisted mission. Some tried to shield others, some prayed aloud in desperation, and some simply fell in silence. Within minutes, 9 lives were stolen. The fellowship hall, once a sanctuary of peace, was transformed into a scene of unimaginable horror. Survivors, including Polly Shepard and Felicia Sanders, were left trembling, drenched in grief and fear. They had witnessed the massacre firsthand, carrying the burden of trauma that would never leave them. Ruth spared them not out of mercy, but out of calculation. He wanted them to tell the world what he had done, to spread the message of hate he believed would ignite conflict. Outside, Charleston carried on unaware, its quiet streets soon to be shattered by the news of the massacre. What had unfolded inside Mother Emanuel was more than murder. It was an assault on history, on community, and on faith itself. The ripples of that night would travel far beyond Charleston, sparking debates, protests, mourning, and ultimately, a reckoning with the deep scars of racism still etched into the soul of America. The news spread through Charleston before midnight, rippling out from phones and police radios until the entire city seemed to hold its breath. At first, there was confusion, whispers of gunfire inside Mother Emanuel, and then the horrifying truth began to emerge. 9 people were dead. The names had not yet been confirmed, but for the community, the church was family, and the loss was instantly personal. Within hours, the streets outside the church filled with people clutching candles, embracing strangers, and weeping as they sang hymns of comfort. The towering white steeple of Emmanuel AME, which had stood through centuries of persecution, became the center of a city's grief. Police quickly identified the suspect. Surveillance cameras captured images of the young white man who had sat among the parishioners and then opened fire. His face, pale and unassuming, was broadcast across every screen in America. The manhunt began with urgency, helicopters sweeping across the Carolinas, officers scouring highways, and federal agents joining local police. The suspect's name, Dylan Roof, was released within hours. He was armed, dangerous, and on the run. Authorities feared he might strike again. By morning, the search came to an end. Roof was spotted in Shelby, North Carolina, nearly 250 miles from Charleston. A local woman noticed his car, a black Hyundai, matching the vehicle description released by police. She called 911. Officers intercepted him during a traffic stop, where he surrendered without resistance. In the car, investigators found his handgun, the Glock .45 he had used to carry out the massacre. The arrest was almost anticlimactic, his demeanor calm, as if he had accomplished what he set out to do. As news of his capture broke, Charleston continued to reel from the devastation. Families of the victims gathered in church basements and community halls, waiting for official word, though many already knew in their hearts. The weight of grief was crushing. Clementa Pinckney's death was a double blow. His role as pastor and as a respected state senator made the tragedy resonate even more deeply across South Carolina. For his wife and 2 young daughters, the loss was unfathomable. Across the city, schools mourned teachers, librarians, and coaches who had shaped young lives. Families grieved mothers, fathers, aunts, and grandparents whose absence would echo in homes and neighborhoods for years to come. What followed in the days after was something remarkable. Rather than erupting in violence or anger, Charleston responded with unity and grace. Thousands poured into the streets not in rage, but in mourning, holding hands across racial lines. Vigils lit up the city night after night. Prayers were whispered on street corners. In the courthouse at Rufe's bond hearing, family members of the victims stunned the nation. One by one, they stood before the judge and addressed the man accused of murdering their loved ones. Through trembling voices and tears, many spoke words of forgiveness. "I forgive you," said Nadine Collier, whose mother, Ethel Lance, had been killed. Her voice cracked, but her faith was resolute. "You took something very precious away from me, but I forgive you, and may God have mercy on your soul." Those words, echoed by others, became a defining moment, embodying the strength of faith and the radical grace of a community rooted in love. The massacre, however, ignited a national reckoning. Across the United States, conversations about racism, hate crimes, and symbols of white supremacy exploded into the mainstream. At the center of this was the Confederate flag. In the days after the shooting, images surfaced of Rufe posing with the flag, treating it as a banner of his twisted beliefs. For many in the South, the flag had long been defended as a symbol of heritage, but for African Americans, it represented slavery, oppression, and violence. With 9 lives lost in Charleston, the pressure mounted to remove the Confederate flag from the South Carolina State House grounds, where it had flown for decades. Protests erupted, politicians debated, and within a month, the flag was taken down in a ceremony witnessed by thousands. Investigators began piecing together Rufe's path to violence. His journal and online writings revealed the depth of his indoctrination. He had spent countless hours on white nationalist websites, reading manifestos that claimed black people were a threat to society. He had searched for crime statistics manipulated to fuel racist narratives. In his writings, he explained that he chose a church because he knew black people would be gathered there in trust and peace. His intention was to spread fear, to make African Americans feel unsafe even in their most sacred spaces. What shocked investigators was how deliberate and calculated his actions were. He had visited the church multiple times before the shooting, even sitting in his car watching, planning the best moment to attack. Meanwhile, the victims' stories became central to the narrative. Each name carried with it a legacy of love, service, and faith. Vigils and funerals turned into celebrations of lives well lived, even as grief hung heavy in the air. President Barack Obama delivered the eulogy at Clementa Pinckney's funeral, his words weaving through the history of racism in America, the resilience of faith, and the urgent call for change. In a moment that became iconic, Obama broke into song, leading the congregation in amazing grace, his voice carrying across the church and through the television screens of millions watching. It was a rare instance where the grief of a nation found expression in the power of song. Rufe's trial loomed as the next chapter. He faced both state and federal charges, including hate crimes, obstruction of religion, and murder. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty, citing not only the brutality of the act but also its racial motivation. Rufe's defense attorneys tried to argue against execution, pointing to his youth and troubled background, but Rufe himself complicated their efforts. He refused to show remorse, rejected psychological evaluations, and insisted on representing himself during portions of the trial. In court, he sat emotionless, often staring blankly ahead, seemingly indifferent to the suffering he had caused. For survivors like Felicia Sanders and Polly Shepard, testifying in court was an ordeal that forced them to relive the horror. They described the Bible study, the sudden eruption of gunfire, and the unimaginable sight of loved ones falling beside them. Their voices trembled as they spoke, but their presence was a testament to resilience. The courtroom, heavy with grief, became a place where the nation confronted the reality of hate-driven violence. Charleston continued to heal in the shadow of loss. Community leaders pushed for dialogue, schools incorporated discussions about racism and tolerance, and churches across denominations reached out to one another in solidarity. Murals were painted, memorials erected, and the names of the Emanuel Nine were etched into the city's memory. The church itself reopened just days after the massacre, its pews filled to capacity as worshippers refused to let violence silence their faith. But beneath the resilience, questions lingered. How had a young man barely out of adolescence been radicalized so deeply online? What role did the internet play in nurturing extremist beliefs? Could stronger gun laws have prevented him from obtaining a weapon so easily? These questions fueled ongoing debates across the nation, as politicians, activists, and citizens searched for answers. The massacre at Emanuel AME was not just an isolated act of violence. It was a mirror held up to America's struggle with racism, hatred, and the enduring wounds of history. The trial and eventual sentencing of Dylann Roof would mark a legal conclusion, but for the families and the community of Charleston, the path to healing was far longer. Each Sunday, when the congregation gathered at Mother Emanuel, the empty seats were reminders of the lives stolen. Yet the voices that rose in hymns, the prayers that filled the sanctuary, and the faith that refused to die carried forward the legacy of the nine who had given their lives in devotion to their God and their community. The trial of Dylann Roof became one of the most closely watched court cases in modern American history. The gravity of the crime, the weight of the symbolism, and the chilling absence of remorse made every day in the courtroom feel like a confrontation not only with one man but with the very idea of hate itself. Federal prosecutors presented their case methodically, laying out how Roof had planned his massacre with precision, how he had studied Emanuel AME Church, and how he had walked in on that June evening under the guise of fellowship before turning his gun on worshippers who had welcomed him without hesitation. The evidence was overwhelming, but what captured the most attention was Roof himself. He sat expressionless, often avoiding eye contact, sometimes scribbling in notebooks, sometimes staring blankly ahead as survivors and family members described the devastation he had caused. What shocked many observers was Roof's decision to represent himself for parts of the trial. He dismissed his defense lawyers at key stages, insisting he did not want them to argue that he was mentally ill. He seemed determined to control his narrative, even if it meant sabotaging his own defense. At one point, he stood before the jury and told them flatly, "I still feel like I had to do it." These words confirmed what many already knew. He had no remorse. He was not seeking mercy, nor did he want to be understood. He wanted to be remembered. The prosecution, meanwhile, emphasized the deliberate cruelty of his actions. They described how Roof had spared two survivors intentionally so they could spread the story of what he had done. They pointed to his writings, his online manifesto filled with racist rants, and the photos of him brandishing Confederate flags and symbols of apartheid regimes. They painted a portrait of a young man consumed by hate, who carefully chose a church not only because of its symbolic importance, but because he believed it would send the strongest message of fear. For the survivors, testifying was an act of courage. Felicia Sanders told the jury how she had tried to shield her granddaughter beneath a table as bullets ripped through the fellowship hall, how she had prayed aloud as her son, Tawanza, lay dying. Polly Shepard recounted the chilling moment when Roof pointed his gun at her but then lowered it, telling her he was sparing her so she could live to tell what happened. Their words carried the raw pain of memory, but also a determination that the truth of that night would never be erased. In January 2017, the jury returned with its verdict. Dylann Roof was found guilty on 33 federal charges, including hate crimes resulting in death, obstruction of religion, and firearms violations. The penalty phase of the trial brought even more emotional testimony, as families of the Emanuel 9 shared stories of lives lost, the absence felt in their homes, and the enduring scars of grief. The jury deliberated and returned with the ultimate sentence: death. Roof became the first person in U.S. history to be sentenced to death for federal hate crimes. The sentencing did not bring closure, but it marked a milestone in the pursuit of justice. Some family members welcomed the decision, seeing it as a measure of accountability for the scale of his crime. Others, rooted deeply in faith, said they would continue to pray for his soul, even as they carried the weight of their loss. For Charleston, the sentence was less about Roof himself and more about affirming the value of the lives he had tried to erase. As the years passed, the Charleston church shooting remained a defining moment in America's struggle with race and violence. The massacre forced a confrontation with symbols long defended as heritage but recognized by many as emblems of hate. The lowering of the Confederate flag from the South Carolina State House grounds was a direct result of the tragedy, a powerful gesture that acknowledged the pain of centuries of oppression. Across the country, conversations about white supremacy, gun laws, and the radicalization of young men online gained urgency. Mother Emanuel itself became both a place of mourning and of pilgrimage. Visitors from around the world came to stand in its pews, to pray, to leave flowers, or simply to bear witness to the resilience of a congregation that refused to be silenced. The church established scholarships and community programs in honor of the Emanuel 9, ensuring that their legacies lived on not only in memory but in tangible acts of hope. Memorials were built, books were written, and documentaries were produced, each one contributing to the preservation of the story. The families of the victims carried their grief into advocacy. Some became vocal in the fight for stronger gun control measures, arguing that no family should endure the kind of loss they had suffered. Others dedicated themselves to preserving the legacy of their loved ones through community service, mentorship, and education. Cynthia Hurd's family, for example, launched literacy initiatives in her honor, extending her lifelong passion for books and learning. Sharonda Coleman Singleton's children spoke publicly about their mother's faith and love, using her story to inspire others. Tawanza Sanders' family promoted leadership programs for young people, hoping to channel his ambition and courage into future generations. Dylan Roof, confined to a cell on federal death row, remained defiant. He filed appeals, none of which expressed regret or acknowledgement of the pain he caused. Instead, he continued to assert his racist beliefs, isolated and unrepentant. His existence behind bars served as a reminder of the persistence of hate, but also of its futility. While he sought to inspire others, what emerged instead was a powerful counter-narrative of unity, resilience, and forgiveness. The Charleston church shooting became part of a broader tapestry of hate-fueled violence in America, often compared with attacks at synagogues, mosques, and other sacred spaces. Each time, the story of Mother Emanuel was recalled, both as a warning and as a source of inspiration. The resilience of the Emanuel AME congregation, their willingness to forgive, and their insistence on holding fast to faith in the face of evil became guiding principles for communities grappling with tragedy. Years later, the image that endured was not Roof's pale, defiant face, but the sight of families standing in courtrooms and speaking words of forgiveness. It was the sound of thousands singing "Amazing Grace" as President Obama led a congregation in mourning. It was the quiet strength of a church reopening its doors just days after the massacre, its pews filled with believers refusing to bow to fear. It was murals of the Emanuel 9 painted on city walls, their faces radiant with light, their names etched into the conscience of Charleston and beyond. The massacre was an unspeakable act of violence, but it was also a revelation. It revealed the depths of hatred that still lingered in society, but it also revealed the extraordinary capacity of human beings to choose love over vengeance, to seek unity over division, and to hold on to faith when the world seemed to shatter. In that way, the Emanuel 9 left behind more than the tragedy of their deaths. They left a legacy of courage, grace, and unwavering belief in the power of love. And so, the story of the Charleston church shooting stands not only as a chapter of darkness in American history, but as a testament to resilience. In the heart of Charleston, Beneath the towering steeple of Mother Emanuel, the voices of the fallen still echo. Their lives, their service, and their faith continue to inspire, reminding the world that even in the face of hatred, grace can shine, and love can endure. In the heart of London, a peaceful night of Ramadan prayers turned into chaos when a van plowed into worshippers outside a mosque. One man died, many were injured, and a community faced terror head-on. This is the chilling story of hate, resilience, and justice you can't look away from. On June 18, 2017, the City of London carried on with its usual rhythm, yet for its Muslim community the night held a special significance. Ramadan was in full swing, and in neighborhoods like Finsbury Park, the streets were alive even after midnight. Families gathered for late-night meals, worshippers streamed into mosques for terawih prayers, and the atmosphere was one of devotion, reflection, and community bonding. The area around the Finsbury Park Mosque was no different. Men and women, young and old, moved through the streets with a sense of calm purpose, their minds fixed on faith and fasting. None of them could know that this sacred night of prayer would soon be shattered by an act of hatred. Hundreds of miles away in Cardiff, Darren Osborne was consumed by a darker mindset. A 47-year-old man with a troubled personal history, Osborne had been living a chaotic life. He was known in his community as a heavy drinker, often unpredictable, with a temper that alienated those around him. His personal relationships were fractured, his career non-existent, and his reputation tainted by instability. For years, he had drifted without direction, but in the weeks before June 2017, his life took a violent turn. Drawn into far-right propaganda online and through television, Osborne became fixated on Muslims. Each news report of Islamist terrorism, particularly the recent Manchester Arena bombing, seemed to push him further into anger. He immersed himself in extremist narratives, finding in them a twisted sense of purpose. Those who knew him noticed a disturbing transformation. Where once he had been erratic but familiar, now he was brooding and obsessed. Osborne spoke of revenge, of striking back, of taking a stand against what he believed was a threat to his country. In reality, his words echoed the poison of extremist voices he had been listening to, voices that thrived on division and demonization. Friends recalled his sudden rants against Muslims. Neighbors remembered his unhinged comments, and family members later admitted they were alarmed by his radicalized mindset. Osborne, a man whose life had been defined by failure, had finally found something to cling to: hatred. With that hatred came a plan, crude but deadly. Osborne decided to weaponize the most ordinary of objects: a van. He rented the vehicle under the guise of a regular transaction, but his true intention was far darker. He would drive into a crowd of Muslims, causing as much destruction as possible. His timing was not random. Ramadan provided him with the opportunity he sought. He knew mosques would be crowded late at night, and worshippers would gather on pavements after prayer. Osborne wanted blood on the streets, and he believed the attack would make him remembered. In Finsbury Park, the evening unfolded peacefully. Inside the mosque, worshippers prayed shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising in unison as they completed the long cycles of terawih. Outside, conversations lingered in the summer air. Among the congregation was 51-year-old Makram Ali, a father of 6 and grandfather, a man known for his kindness and humility. For Ali, like many others, Ramadan was a time to strengthen his faith, to reflect on life, and to draw closer to his family and community. That night, he left his home with devotion in his heart, unaware that fate was about to intervene in the most brutal way. Shortly after midnight on June 19th, as prayers concluded, people spilled out of the mosque. The air was filled with greetings, small talk, and the soft footsteps of those returning home. Ali walked with them but soon felt unwell and collapsed on the pavement. Concerned worshippers immediately rushed to his aid, some kneeling beside him, others calling for medical help. Their actions reflected the spirit of compassion that defined their faith, a readiness to help, to care, to protect. But in those very moments of kindness, death was bearing down on them. Osborne steered the van through the streets of London, his mind locked on the plan. Witnesses later described his expression as cold, detached, almost mechanical as he maneuvered the large vehicle toward his target. And then, with chilling deliberation, he accelerated. The van swerved onto the pavement outside the mosque, plowing into the crowd gathered around Makram Ali. The impact was catastrophic. Bodies were flung to the ground, some struck head-on, others dragged by the force of the vehicle. Screams ripped through the night as confusion turned instantly to horror. Worshippers who had been offering comfort only moments before now found themselves injured, bleeding, or scrambling to safety. Makram Ali, already collapsed from his earlier illness, was fatally struck. In the space of seconds, a scene of peace and compassion had been transformed into carnage. What followed was chaos. Survivors shouted in panic. Others rushed to pull the injured from danger. The van came to a halt, and Osborne attempted to escape, but he was immediately confronted by those he had attacked. Driven by shock and anger, several men dragged him from the driver's seat and pinned him to the ground. Osborne struggled, shouting hateful words, trying to provoke outrage, but the community responded with discipline. Voices among the crowd urged restraint, insisting that he not be harmed. The instinct for justice, not vengeance, prevailed. At the center of this restraint was Imam Muhammad Mahmud, the spiritual leader of the mosque. Arriving quickly on the scene, he saw the crowd's fury and the danger it posed. In a powerful display of leadership, he stepped between Osborne and the bystanders, urging them to remain calm. "Do not hurt him," he told them firmly. His words carried weight. In that moment of chaos, the Imam's guidance prevented the night from descending into further violence. Osborne was kept alive, restrained but unharmed, until police arrived. Within minutes, emergency services swarmed the area. Ambulances rushed the injured to hospitals. Police secured the crime scene, and investigators began piecing together the attack. The community, still in shock, struggled to process what had just unfolded. The mosque that had stood as a beacon of resilience was now a crime scene, and its worshippers the victims of terror. For the family of Makram Ali, grief was immediate and overwhelming. Their loved one had gone to prayer and would never return home. As dawn approached, news of the attack spread rapidly. Londoners awoke to headlines of another act of terror, this time not from Islamist extremists but from a man radicalized by far-right hatred. The Finsbury Park van attack marked a grim shift in the narrative. Extremism was not bound to one ideology, but could emerge from any corner of society where hatred took root. The incident forced the nation to confront a painful reality, that terrorism wears many faces, and that unchecked bigotry can be just as lethal as the ideologies it claims to oppose. The story of that night would continue to unfold in the days and months to come, but in those first hours, one truth was undeniable. The attack was not just a crime against individuals but an assault on the values of community, faith, and coexistence. It revealed the dangers of radicalization, the devastating impact of hate, and the extraordinary courage of those who chose restraint and humanity in the face of brutality. The minutes after the van attack at Finsbury Park were marked by scenes of chaos that would forever stay with those who witnessed them. It was just after midnight, and in the heart of North London, a quiet Ramadan night had turned into something resembling a battlefield. The air was filled with the sound of sirens, shouts, and cries of anguish. Men and women stumbled across the pavement in shock, some bleeding, others helping those more severely injured. The headlights of the van still glared across the street, illuminating bodies sprawled on the ground where moments earlier conversations and greetings had taken place. In the center of the devastation lay Makram Ali, the 51-year-old father and grandfather who had collapsed before the van even mounted the curb. Worshippers who had bent down to aid him now found themselves among the victims. For Ali's family, the hours that followed would bring unbearable grief. They would learn that the man who had gone to the mosque to worship in peace had instead been cut down in an act of hatred. His children described him as a gentle, loving figure who always put family first. To the wider community, his death became the clearest symbol of the senselessness of the violence. The crowd's attention quickly shifted to the man responsible. Darren Osborne, pulled from the van by those he sought to harm, now lay pinned on the ground. His face was marked with panic, but also with defiance. Witnesses said he shouted inflammatory remarks, declaring that he wanted to kill Muslims and boasting about his actions. For many in the crowd, anger surged. The instinct to retaliate was strong. The devastation around them was fresh, and the man who caused it was right before their eyes. But as rage threatened to boil over, calm voices pushed through. Imam Muhammad Mahmud, who had arrived swiftly at the scene, intervened with remarkable composure. He stood between Osborne and the furious worshippers, urging them to hold back. His voice carried authority and a plea for justice over vengeance. The Imam reminded everyone that the man who had brought them such pain must not be harmed, that he should be handed over to the authorities alive. This moment would later be seen as one of extraordinary restraint and leadership. At a time when emotions could easily have spilled into violence, the community showed discipline. Osborne remained restrained, held down firmly but unharmed, until police officers arrived. Officers quickly moved in, taking custody of the attacker as the crowd looked on. Some shouted angrily, others cried, but there was no mob justice. The same community targeted for destruction had shown that their strength lay not in retaliation but in dignity. Meanwhile, paramedics and emergency responders rushed to save lives. 11 people were injured in the attack, some severely. The injured were loaded into ambulances under the flashing blue lights that turned the night into a surreal scene. Survivors described the disorienting moments immediately after the crash. The ringing in their ears, the taste of blood, the sight of friends and relatives lying motionless on the ground. Some prayed aloud as they awaited help. Others clutched their wounds and tried to remain conscious. The pavement outside the mosque, once a place of greetings and shared faith, had become a triage zone. The police quickly confirmed what many suspected. This was a deliberate terrorist attack. For the first time in recent British history, the terrorist was not someone radicalized by Islamist extremism but by far-right ideology. Osborne's motivations became clearer as investigators pieced together his recent past. He had rented the van in Cardiff with the express intention of using it as a weapon. His family admitted they had noticed a disturbing change in him in the weeks before. He had been consumed by anger, glued to television and online content filled with anti-Muslim rhetoric. Neighbors remembered his sudden rants, his obsession with recent terror attacks, and his chilling comments that suggested he wanted to strike back. In interviews that followed, Osborne's estranged partner described him as unstable and volatile. She revealed that his behavior had deteriorated to the point of alarming his children. His son would later recall moments when Osborne spoke about Muslims in dehumanizing terms, words that seemed disconnected from the man they once knew. For investigators, it became clear. Osborne had become radicalized not by religion, but by extremist voices on the fringes of society who thrived on spreading hatred. He had taken their words and turned them into violent action. The attack sent shockwaves across London and the United Kingdom. Political leaders condemned the violence in the strongest terms. Prime Minister Theresa May declared it a terrorist attack and emphasized that hatred, in any form, would not be tolerated. The mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, himself a Muslim, spoke of the pain inflicted on his community and the need for unity in the face of division. Faith leaders from across the spectrum, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Sikh, stood in solidarity with Muslims, visiting Finsbury Park Mosque and offering words of comfort. The country, already reeling from a series of extremist attacks in 2017, was forced to confront the reality that terrorism was not confined to one ideology. Media coverage captured the grief of the community and the heroism that had prevented greater bloodshed. Images of the van, of worshippers in prayer amid the chaos, of police officers securing the scene, dominated headlines. One photograph that struck a chord showed Imam Mahmud standing before cameras, explaining how his community had restrained itself from harming Osborne. His words became a powerful reminder of the difference between vengeance and justice. For survivors, the days after the attack were filled with hospital visits, bandages, and trauma. Many spoke of recurring nightmares, flashbacks of headlights bearing down on them, and the sound of bodies hitting metal. Others expressed fear of simply walking outside the mosque, a place that had always felt like a sanctuary. Parents worried for their children's safety, elders wondered how long their community would be targeted, and young worshippers struggled to reconcile their faith with the violence inflicted upon them. The scars, both physical and emotional, would last long after the police tape was removed. As the investigation deepened, prosecutors built their case. They uncovered evidence of Osborne's radicalization, angry rants in pubs, written notes expressing violent intentions, and testimony from those who had witnessed his obsession with revenge. The conclusion was clear. The Finsbury Park attack was terrorism, fueled by Islamophobia and extremist propaganda. It was not a spontaneous act of violence, but a planned assault meant to terrorize an entire community. The community of Finsbury Park responded with resilience. Vigils were held where candles lit the night in memory of Makram Ali. Thousands gathered, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, holding signs that read, "United against hate." Speeches called for peace, unity, and understanding. While grief weighed heavily on the families of victims, there was also pride in the way the community had responded, with compassion, courage, and the refusal to be divided. For the family of Makram Ali, the loss was immeasurable. His children described their father as someone who lived quietly, cared deeply, and sought no recognition except in the love of his family. His absence left a void that could never be filled. Yet they too echoed the calls for peace, insisting that his memory be honored not with anger but with strength and faith. Their dignity in the face of tragedy mirrored the restraint shown by the worshippers that night, a testament to values that hatred could not destroy. As Osborne sat in custody awaiting trial, the nation began to reckon with the broader implications. Questions were raised about the rise of far-right extremism, the role of online propaganda, and the dangers of unchecked hate speech. Security services, long focused on Islamist extremism, were forced to broaden their scope and acknowledge that terrorism had many faces. The attack at Finsbury Park became a turning point in public awareness, a grim reminder that extremism was not limited to one ideology, but a threat wherever hatred was allowed to fester. The arrest of Darren Osborne in the early hours of June 19, 2017, marked the beginning of a new chapter in the story of the Finsbury Park van attack. With the immediate chaos of the night under control and the victims receiving medical treatment, attention shifted to the investigation and the long legal process that would determine Osborne's fate. For the community, the memory of the attack was raw, but they were determined that justice would be carried out through the courts rather than through vengeance. That resolve, tested in the heat of the moment, would become the foundation of the story that unfolded over the following months. Osborne was quickly identified as a man from Cardiff with a troubled past, someone with no formal ties to organized groups but steeped in extremist rhetoric. In police custody, he showed no remorse. Instead, he repeated anti-Muslim sentiments, trying to justify his actions as a response to Islamist terrorism. Investigators soon pieced together his path to radicalization. Osborne had spent weeks absorbing far-right propaganda, much of it online, which painted Muslims as enemies and pushed narratives of cultural conflict. His notebooks, found during searches, contained scribbled messages expressing violent intent. Witnesses testified that, in the days before the attack, he had ranted about Muslims, calling for action and revenge. The portrait that emerged was not of a disciplined extremist, but of a man whose personal failures and vulnerabilities had been weaponized by the poisonous rhetoric of hate. The trial began in January 2018 at Woolwich Crown Court. It drew intense media attention, not only because of the brutality of the attack, but because it was one of the few terrorist cases in recent British history carried out by someone radicalized by far-right ideology rather than Islamist extremism. Osborne stood in the dock, accused of murder and attempted murder. The prosecution's case was clear. This was a deliberate act of terrorism. They presented evidence of his planning, including the rented van, his notes, and the testimonies of those who heard him speak of his intentions. Survivors recounted the moments of horror, their words painting a vivid picture of headlights bearing down on them, the impact of metal against bodies, and the chaos that followed. The family of Makram Ali sat through the proceedings, their grief evident but their dignity unshaken. They listened as witnesses described how Ali had collapsed before the van struck, how he lay helpless on the pavement, and how Osborne's deliberate acceleration sealed his fate. For them, the trial was not just about legal justice but about ensuring that the truth of what happened was laid bare for the world to see. Osborne's defense was erratic. At one point, he claimed he had not been driving the van, suggesting that a supposed accomplice had taken control. This story quickly fell apart under scrutiny, dismissed by the jury as implausible. His attempts to evade responsibility only underscored his lack of remorse. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his shifting narrative did little to inspire sympathy. As the trial unfolded, experts testified about the rise of far-right extremism in Britain. They spoke of the dangers of online radicalization, of how ordinary individuals like Osborne could be drawn into hateful ideologies without belonging to organized groups. The case highlighted a shift in the landscape of terrorism, forcing both the public and security services to confront the fact that extremism was not confined to one ideology. Osborne's actions were not isolated but part of a wider pattern of violence, fueled by division and propaganda. In February 2018, the jury returned its verdict. Osborne was found guilty of the murder of Makram Ali and the attempted murder of several others. The judge, Mr. Justice Chimagrub, delivered a scathing statement during sentencing. She condemned Osborne's actions as a deliberate act of terrorism motivated by hatred, describing him as a man who had acted alone but whose mind had been poisoned by extremist voices. She sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 43 years, ensuring that Osborne would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The verdict was met with relief by the victims and their families. For the Ali family, it was a moment of justice, though no sentence could ever bring back their father and grandfather. They issued a statement honoring Makram's memory, describing him as a man of peace whose life had been cruelly taken, but whose legacy would endure in the love of his family. They called for unity, rejecting the hatred that had killed him. Their strength, shown throughout the ordeal, resonated far beyond Finsbury Park. The attack and its aftermath left lasting scars, but it also left powerful lessons. For the Muslim community of Finsbury Park, the trauma of that night remained vivid. Survivors spoke of nightmares, of reliving the moment when the van struck, of hearing again the screams and cries. Some carried visible injuries, while others bore invisible wounds of fear and anxiety. Yet they also spoke of resilience, of the solidarity shown by neighbors, faith leaders, and strangers who came to support them. Vigils continued in the months after the attack, with candles lit for the victims and prayers said for peace. Nationally, the attack shifted the conversation about terrorism. It forced recognition that extremist violence could come from any direction, that hate-fueled ideologies were not limited to one community or religion. Counterterrorism strategies began to place greater emphasis on monitoring far-right extremism, acknowledging it as a growing threat. Faith leaders across the country redoubled efforts to promote dialogue and understanding, determined that division would not prevail. The role of the community on the night of the attack remained a defining part of the story. The restraint shown by worshippers, guided by Imam Muhammad Mahmud, became a powerful symbol. In interviews and documentaries, the Imam described how he felt compelled to protect Osborne, not because he sympathized with him, but because he believed justice must be served through law, not mob violence. His actions were praised widely, hailed as an example of moral courage that stood in stark contrast to the hatred that had motivated the attack. For London, a city already scarred by terrorist violence in 2017, the Finsbury Park attack underscored its vulnerability, but also its resilience. It revealed the deep fractures that extremist ideologies sought to exploit, but it also showcased the capacity of communities to resist being torn apart. In the years that followed, memorials were held to remember Makram Ali, and his name became synonymous with the innocent lives lost to hatred. The story of the Finsbury Park van attack is ultimately one of contrasts. On one side was Osborne, a man consumed by bitterness, radicalized by propaganda, and driven to commit murder in the name of hatred. On the other side was a community that responded with compassion, restraint, and dignity, even in the face of unspeakable loss. The legacy of that night lies not only in the tragedy of lives cut short and families torn apart, but also in the resilience of those who refused to let hate define them. In the end, Osborne's act of terror failed in its true aim. He sought to divide, to incite fear and anger, to pit communities against one another. Instead, the response of the Finsbury Park community and the wider nation was one of solidarity. People of all faiths and backgrounds stood together, refusing to let hatred win. Makram Ali's memory lives on not only in his family's hearts, but in the enduring message that love and unity are stronger than fear and violence. And though the scars of that night remain, so too does the proof that even in the darkest of moments, humanity can shine through.